The opinions on this program are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WPSL. WPSL does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WPSL. Legal questions? Ask a lawyer. Give us a call at 340-1590, 340-1590 here at the studios of WPSL. And Ask a Lawyer with your host, attorney Stuart M. Address.
And a little bit of a different twist today. Stuart is not here, so it's really not Ask a Lawyer. We have a guest in the studio. Welcome.
Hi there, I am Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim in Port St. Lucie, Florida.
And you're filling in for Stuart today.
I am filling in for Stuart today, yes. So this is not Ask a Lawyer, this is Ask a Rabbi.
Okay. But the phone lines are still open for questions.
Absolutely.
Sure.
More than willing to take any questions. And the topic that I was going to talk about today is Passover and perhaps looking at some of its connections to Easter for those who are not familiar with Passover and what it's all about. So we'll start out by talking about it. Passover is one of the festivals, one of the Jewish festivals that is mentioned in scriptures. It is based on coming out of Egypt. And like all Jewish holidays, there are multiple reasons behind it. And it's Pesach, the lambing festival, actually, is what Pesach refers to. And so there's always three reasons for a holiday when we have a scriptural holiday, a biblical holiday. Passover is no different. Pesach is the name that it takes from the lambing. It also is Chag HaMatzot, the festival of matzah. Matzah is unleavened bread. And then the third name for it is Zman Cherutzenu, the time of our freedom, because that talks about coming out of the slavery that we had in Egypt. And it's a different kind of slavery than the slavery that we saw in early United States history. It's actually probably closer to undocumented workers, is something closer to it. It was that kind of service. And it refers to coming out and becoming our own nation. So let's unpack all of those different names and look at where they come from. And that might spark some questions from some of you who are hoping to ask a lawyer this morning, but you get a chance instead to ask a rabbi. So maybe you've had a dying question that you'd like to do. So Chag HaPesach is the festival of the lambing. And anyone who's worked with animals might understand this one. People were in those days shepherds, and they also were farmers. The second festival is for the farmers. So back again to the shepherds, Chag HaPesach is the lambing festival. And let's imagine that God was really generous and you had 100 new male sheep last year, or female sheep rather, last year that were born to your herd. And they're about a year old, which means they're about to come into heat and they can start to have their own little babies. How many males do you need to service the 100 sheep that you had? Probably only a handful. You really only need one. You'd be very busy, but you probably would have a small handful of them, just in case something happened to one or the other. But nature, because on the average we're half male, half female, has also blessed you with, give or take, 100 males. And the problem with 100 yearling males is that they're acting much like adolescent young males. And when the females go in heat, it actually can get very bloody and very dangerous in the herd. And all of those males need to be separated or eliminated from the herd. And so it was a natural time of culling the herd, basically killing those that you weren't going to use for your breeding program. Now, you would have during the year slaughtered any that you obviously weren't going to use for your breeding program, but you normally, in animal husbandry, wait as long as you can to get the best samples that you can for your breeding program. So people have a good number of that original 100 males still running around, and it's a time that they have to be slaughtered if you're going to do that. And if you're going to slaughter a whole bunch of animals and you don't have refrigeration and you can't put it in plastic and put it in the supermarket, you call all your neighbors and friends and you have a party.
Okay.
And that's Chag HaPesach, the slaughtering of the yearling male sheep. It's worth noting that almost all of the sacrifices are males. because in a breeding culture, folks that are dependent on animals, it makes sense to get rid of the unnecessary males. So that is the Chag HaPesach. It is that ancient agricultural lambing festival. The other name was Chag HaMatzot, the winter wheat festival. You would have just harvested the winter wheat in that part of the world. And one of the things that we've now learned in science is that if you've got wheat stored in the ground and it gets wet, it can develop one of the most toxic bacteria that we have on the planet. And that actually, some scholars believe that may be connected to the plague of the death of the firstborn, and I'll get back to that again as well. But if you're bringing in your winter harvest and you've got all of this fresh wheat, you want to eliminate any of the older wheat that you might have in the ground. And so you're going to clean it out, and you're going to clean it meticulously. You want to get rid of every last scrap of wheat that you might have in those storerooms. And then you want to eat bread for dinner.
Sure.
You know, we always have bread, right? And so you don't have time to let it sit, because they didn't have instant yeast that you take a spoonful and you throw it in. The bread in my kitchen is now sitting rising as I sit here. Didn't have that luxury. You had to let it sit a day or two or three to pick up the yeast that's available in the air. And so you would make a flatbread, an unleavened bread. Probably looked a lot more like either a tortilla or a lavash, any of those flatbreads that don't have much rising to them. And whether it was soft or hard is what would decide whether it was more like the flatbread or more like a tortilla. And there's people who say that it was one or the other. It certainly didn't come square with corrugated pieces and hopefully tasting a little bit better than the box it comes in, which is matzah. But it refers to any of the bread that would have been prepared quickly. And in fact, today we say you've got 18 minutes from the time the water hits the flour until it's baked. Otherwise, it's not matzah, because it can start to pick up some yeast from the outside. Won't pick up a lot, but it could pick up some. And so the manufacturers of matzah, it's a very fast process, very time controlled. And that represents the bread that would have been eaten quickly from your new winter harvest, the Chag HaMatzot. Again, this predates even the Exodus coming out of Egypt, but it certainly is the root of the holiday. And all of these things happen around the same time. The third reason for the festival is, in fact, coming out of that, being able to enjoy freedom, being able to worship as we felt we needed to, as we felt God called us to, and respond to that instead of doing somebody else's responsibilities, instead of having to work perhaps on the Saturday, which I'm sure we did. And I'm sure many people today are having to work when they don't want to. And the joy of being able to not do that, to be able to spend time with family and friends and with God, is a time of freedom. The interesting part out of that to me is that always whenever we talk about that, we're also reminded that we have a responsibility to those who are oppressed, because we remember what it was to be oppressed. And Scripture over and over says, do not be oppressive to people because you were once oppressed. So if you remember what it's like to be on the receiving end, don't put somebody else in that place. So the festival incorporates all of those things. Now, you might notice that I just barely mentioned the plagues. They are part of the story, but they're a very minimal part of the story for Jews. That's something I think that a lot of people are surprised at. I know that many of my students, I also happen to be an adjunct professor at Indian River State College, and I teach world religions there. And I even enjoy talking about this subject there in that context. So we've got all of those three reasons for this festival. And the original foods eaten for the festival were a little bit of that lamb, the Pesach, a little bit of matzah, and bitter herbs to remember what slavery was like. We're still instructed to eat those things, but since there is no longer a temple standing, we no longer do the lambing part of the festival And so now we just eat the matzah and the bitter herbs, and we talk about the Pesach, the lambs that would have been part of that lambing festival. So you might notice that there's a few different things that people would expect about that. No mention in any of my discussion about blood or anything being put on the door, because that's not a big part of the holiday for us.
Okay.
In fact, most Jews would probably look at you and say, huh? What are you even talking about? They don't even know it. Well, the plagues have a little tiny piece in the Seder, barely mentioned at all, just kind of in passing, as a way of remembering that part of the pain in the creation of the holiday was that the Egyptians suffered. And we're reminded that some of our joy is diminished because somebody had to suffer in the process of coming out of Egypt. Not uncommon that people have to suffer for the decisions of their rulers and their leaders. We're always subject to those who have input into those parts of it. And so that part is not part of the Jewish festival, but when the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, so a little over 1950 years ago, the Seder, the Passover meal, actually went through some radical changes because 1/3 of the meal was not there. And so the sages looked around and they looked to other festivals in the area. They looked at the habits of the Romans. They took a little bit of the Roman Symposium, a little bit of Nowruz, the spring festival from the Persians, and kind of blended that and twisted it with the holiday and came out with the Seder. And so it's a night of questions. Since we can't quite do all of the ancient rituals, we now get to ask about them. And that serves as a way to teach each other, to remind each other what it's like to come out of a tight place, out of slavery, whatever slaveries you have in your life, because we all have them.
Sure.
And one of the values of religious practices is that it is, at one level, all allegory. It all relates to our everyday lives today. We all go through the same things, perhaps not at the same scale, not with the same detail, certainly, but we all go through our tight places. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which means narrow place. Now, perhaps that referred to it being the Nile River, and life was very narrow right along the river because the river was necessary. When it would flood its banks, it would irrigate the crops, and you then could have life, and you were tied to that river. So perhaps Mitzrayim refers to the physical narrowness of life in Egypt in those days until you could take irrigation away from the river. There's not a lot of rain in that part of the world. And so Mitzrayim, it's got the same root as the word surus, which anybody who knows Yiddish knows means trouble. So that it's the tight place in your life. And every day we're invited to remember what it was like to have been oppressed, to have been a slave, and to remember that we came out of it. For Pesach, we're actually to put ourselves back in that place and enjoy the celebration of our own freedoms. So it's a very much a joyous festival, a festival of great celebration. And that's part of the Jewish root. Now, let me go ahead and take a quick look, because we had talked before the show a little bit about how and why Easter is connected to that. And this is coming out of my professorship. And so Easter is tied to the Passover festival, and it's kind of an interesting holiday. It's one of the Christian holidays that moves around on the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar that we're using right now, that's 2018 in the merry month of March. Not quite May yet, but March. And so it moves according to the equinox and according to the lunar part of the calendar. And in fact, in some denominations of Christianity, it cannot happen until Passover occurs. And Passover this year is on the 30th and 31st of March. And in fact, my congregation is having a Seder that is open to the community. You can go to our website and get more information on it if you choose to.
Give us that website.
Give us that website, eitzchayim.org, eitzchayim.org. Or you can look for us on Facebook, again, eitzchayim. We are conveniently located not far from First Data Field, the Met Stadium. So we're right in that area with the Pruitt campus of Indian River, the sports complex, all of that area.
We'll get those websites in your Facebook before you leave the program today, and we'll have them here at the station. So if anyone wants to give us a call, we'll pass those out.
Absolutely, that would be great. And so Easter is tied to that. And when we really don't know exactly when things happened in Jesus' life. We do know that Christians, same as Jews, looked around at other festivals that other people were doing, and things were blended and shifted. For example, the Gospels talk about Jesus' birth as being when the shepherds were out in the fields with their sheep, and they wouldn't have done that in December in Bethlehem. I've been in Bethlehem in the winter. No, you don't go out and play with the sheep. You huddle somewhere inside a building, which would have been why they wanted to stay in the manger instead of just sleeping next to their animals on the outside as well, why they wanted shelter, especially if Mary was pregnant. You would not want to be out in the cold air. So getting back over to Pesach, to Passover, we don't exactly know when Jesus' crucifixion would have occurred. Traditionally, it is tied to the Passover, and the book of John talks about the lambing, slaughtering happening at the temple at the time when he's being crucified, which also points to the idea that the night before would not have been a Seder, certainly not the kind of Seder we do today. First of all, it didn't exist until after Jesus' death. So it would have been a different kind of a festival meal in his lifetime. He certainly did have some kind of a meal and gathering with the disciples. As I like to tell my class, CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, all those folks weren't there with a video camera to record it, so we don't exactly know what it
Recorded
looked like.
history is different now than it may have been.
Yeah, what we're dealing with now are people's memories of what it was like. They didn't even write it down at the time, because they didn't have a need to. They weren't issuing a newspaper. They weren't certainly doing a radio show or any of the ways that we now let people know.
And it was life, not history.
Right. Yeah. They weren't thinking of it as, 2,000 years from now, people are going to
want to know.
Yeah. This is what we're doing. And they told each other the stories as part of their ways of remembering what was happening. So it's a meal that occurs before the slaughtering of the sheep, of the Pesach, of those lambs. And in John's gospel, he wants to compare Jesus to a poor sheep who, his only accident of life is having been born. And so what do you do with that? So he's wanting him to have that innocence attached to him. And so we're told that that's going on. And it certainly is a time of great activity in Jerusalem. Would have been, in those days, one of the 3 times that people tried to get to Jerusalem, the 3 chags, the 3 festivals, the 3 pilgrimages. Pesach in the spring, and then you've also got Shavuot in the summer, one that most people don't know about. And then the third one is Sukkot, the harvest in the fall. That actually is more likely the time, that's certainly the time when Jesus comes into Jerusalem. We don't know how long he's there. Again, nobody recorded those details. But getting back to the Pesach and to Passover, whether it's that time of year or one of the other gathering festivals in Jerusalem, it's clearly a time of much activity. And traditionally, the Christian church has linked it to Pesach, to Passover. And that carries with it the theme of freedom and coming out from the bondage and the tight places in your life. And for Christians, Jesus does offer that image, that function, that purpose, that connectivity. And so that's part of the reason for it. So they're very often together. Sometimes they slip, though, as much as a month. And that has to do with the fact that the Jewish calendar is still a lunar calendar that's intercalated into the solar calendar, because it was an agrarian society of a farming, shepherding community. And, the sheep are going to give birth at a certain time, and the crops are going to come ripe at a certain time. You have to stay connected to the solar calendar for your crops and your herds and your flocks. But the calendar is a lunar because at night you can see where the moon is. It's real easy to clock things on the moon. And when we look at older cultures, Judaism, the Indian cultures, the Chinese cultures, they're on lunar calendars, because until you have something like a world clock ticking away in Boulder, Colorado, you're a little more tied to the things you can see. The days are broken up into daylight hours and the hours when the sun's not out, and the months are cycled on the moon. In fact, you can hear the word moon inside the word month. And so they would have used a lunar calendar. And that's why when you have a year, a leap year, because that's how a lunar calendar connects and stays in the seasons, is that there's an extra month every few years. And that jogs you on, because we're not exactly 12 months in a year. We're not even exactly 365 days.
Right.
We have to do a leap year every 4 years, but not when it's divisible by 100 or 400, or it goes back and forth, a whole bunch of rules. And 2 years ago we had a leap second. I'm sure everybody caught that.
Right.
Because the clock slips just ever so slightly. The atomic world clock is not on the same sync as the planet and the sun. So our division of minutes and hours, not quite perfectly. And so we've got all of that worked into the system. So when that happens, sometimes you can have that extra month Jewishly, but it might not be there on.
In about a minute, we'll be taking a break for the Florida State News, and so we got about a minute.
Okay. That's great. So to wrap that up, if anybody's got any questions about that, we'll be more than happy to take any of those calls if you've got a question you've wondered about. But anyway, so back to, so the calendars are tied together. And
we'll be back with more. It's a special edition of Ask a Lawyer here on WPSL. You have questions or comments, 340-1590. Give us a call here in the studios.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
FNN News. I'm Alan Spector. Lawmakers in Tallahassee have agreed on a nearly $89 billion state budget that boosts funding for the state's public schools by 2.4% or $101 per student. Puts $400 million towards school safety, $52 million to fight the state's opioid crisis, and includes $168 million for sales tax holidays for hurricane preparedness items in June and back-to-school items in August. Lawmakers will have to return to Tallahassee Sunday to vote on the spending package because of the 72-hour cooling-off period required by the state constitution. The budget will then go to Governor Rick Scott. The governor is set to meet with parents of some of those killed in last month's mass shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland to get their input about the school safety provision in the budget before deciding whether to approve it. President Trump says he wants to harden schools and make them less vulnerable to attacks.
To strengthen our early warning system so that when there are red flags, as we had in the case in Florida, there were 39 red flags, which is a disgrace. They were crying out for somebody to go and nab that guy.
Opening a cabinet meeting yesterday, Trump said Congress is moving towards strengthening background checks. He again vowed to use his executive authority to ban gun modifications like bump stocks, which were used by the killer in the Las Vegas massacre. Trump also praised states which are moving to curb gun violence, including Florida. Florida's junior U.S. senator is opposing President Trump's new tariffs. Senator Marco Rubio released a statement yesterday saying tariffs are not a substitute for a national trade strategy. The Republican says he'll propose ideas next week for pro-worker, free and fair trade policies. With news on the Florida News Network, I'm Alan Spector.
Save the date, November 4th, for one of the best events of the season. Wine, Women, and Shoes is coming to the Westin Lake Mary, benefiting the Florida Cancer Specialists Foundation, which provides non-medical living expenses to cancer patients. More information online at foundation.flcancer.com. November 4th, Wine, Women, and Shoes. Get your tickets now at foundation.flcancer.com/WWS17.
Hey neighbor, trying a different weed and feed?
Yeah, this year I want more. Bayer Advanced 3-in-1 Weed and Feed for southern lawns.
But why? We've used Scott's Bonus S for years.
Yeah, Bonus S weeds and feeds, but it doesn't prevent new weeds. Bayer Advanced 3-in-1 Weed and Feed prevents new broadleaf and grassy weeds for up to 6 months.
Wait, even crabgrass?
Even crabgrass. Plus, it has a money-back guarantee.
You sold me.
Bayer Advanced 3-in-1 Weed and Feed for southern lawns. Get more from the blue bag. Always read and follow label instructions.
A Jacksonville high school teacher is facing charges of distributing child porn. FBI agents raided a home in Ponte Vedra yesterday and arrested a man. According to Action News Jax, the suspect is Jeremy Clark, a teacher at First Coast High School. Clark faces up to 20 years in prison and as much as $250,000 in fines if he's found guilty. In southwest Florida, walkers and bikers in Collier County can celebrate what one official calls great news. The Federal Department of Transportation announced this week a $13 million grant has been awarded to Immokalee. The money will be used to build sidewalks, install streetlights, and build shaded bus shelters. The city's Community Redevelopment Agency says the improvements have been needed for years. They tell the Naples Daily News work is expected to finish in 3 years.
Do you have issues on the job with wages or overtime, family and medical leave, disability issues, discrimination, or sexual harassment? Do you have a landlord and tenant problem, or have a contract dispute? Have you been defamed, or have your civil rights been violated? Hello, I'm attorney Stuart M. Address, and for more than 30 years, I've been fighting for the rights of everyday people. I believe in aggressive advocacy combined with personalized attention. That means being available to my clients. It means answering emails, sometimes at 3 in the morning, and checking my messages over the weekend. It means caring about you. If you want to speak with a lawyer who will not be intimidated and who will actually care about you, call my office, Stuart M. Address, PA, at 772-781-8003, or send us a message through our website at www.stuartaddresslaw.com. We will respond to your calls and messages because we care. Our office is in Stuart, Florida.
Ask a Lawyer continues on WPSL. Phone lines are open 340-1590, 340-1590. Now back to your host, attorney Stuart M. Address.
And of course, Stuart isn't here today. We have a special show. Welcome back.
Thank you. And again, I'm Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim in Port St. Lucie, Florida. We are the newest congregation in Port St. Lucie. We're rapidly growing. We are a member of the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism, and Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. So we call ourselves Reform with a renewal flair, which means we're very musical. We enjoy our Jewishness. We have a lot of happiness. We're multi-generational. It's I think, a fun congregation,
Great.
but I'm a little bit biased, as they like to say. And so, yes, I'm standing in for Stuart today, and so I do welcome your calls. It's not Ask a Lawyer. You've got a chance, though, to ask a rabbi any question perhaps you were thinking of wanting to ask a rabbi, dying to know. I welcome any calls that you might give us, and the phone number is
340-1590.
So please do give a call. I'll be glad to answer any questions. We were talking a little bit about Passover, and I was starting to talk about its connection over to Easter. And part of it occurs just simply because that was happening around the time. And again, in the book of John references the lambs being slaughtered because they would have been slaughtered in the morning and afternoon, and then taken home and prepared for the meal. And I always am amused at people who think that animals are not sacrificed today. They are sacrificed for our food. Anybody who is an omnivore, who eats meat, chicken, fish, even if you eat it live, it's not going to survive the process, and so it is slaughtered for your substance, for your enjoyment, whatever the different reasons are that you eat. Some of us live to eat, and some of us eat to live, and we are a combination of all those things. The only difference is we no longer take the animals to a holy place and acknowledge the gift of life in that animal to God, and thank God for that life and that animal. Instead, we wrap it in plastic and put it in
And it comes from the store.
It comes from the store.
I do know of hunters who always say a prayer when they do kill something, and they thank that animal because
absolutely
because of that animal, I get to live and I get to eat.
Right. And so when we talk about an animal being prepared for kosher or even for the Islamic halal, what that basically is the process of acknowledging the gift of the life with God, and thanking God for that, and thanking the animal itself, and perhaps doing some atonement for having to eat it to survive. And that is part of our system. We do eat part of the world, and part of the world eats us. We are part of the planet, and it's an ongoing system that goes back and forth. And it's interesting, a sidebar, going off on one of those little tangents. Jewishly, when we are buried, whatever funeral procedures are used, the object is to get molecules back into the system so that we continue to be part of the living cycle of the planet, with a recognition that, yes, occasionally molecules come or go from our solar system, but not very often. For the most part, we tend to stay our
right
various
here.
molecules right here. Yes, as scientists often like to point out, water that's here is the water that's been here. Before coming to Port St. Lucie, I lived in Tucson, Arizona, and one of the things that's partway between Tucson, just to the north of Tucson before you get to Phoenix, is Biosphere 2. And I suggest to people to actually take a look at that. It was a very fascinating experiment. It's now owned by the University of Arizona, and they continue to do environmental studies there. What Biosphere 2 was a completely contained biosphere. We live in Biosphere 1, and the people who created that experiment really, really sealed it off. And one of the things they were keenly aware of, because 8 people lived inside that bubble.
And if I remember, they didn't come out.
They didn't come
but
out
I don't
for
remember
2 years.
Okay,
It was 2 years. There's actually a book called 2 Years and 20 Minutes written by one of the people who was in it, because at the opening of the Biosphere 2, to release the original crew that lived in it, Jane Goodall was talking, and her talk went 20 minutes over schedule.
Okay.
And so for the people who were inside, every minute
they were waiting for
for the door to open, and she kept talking. And so I hope I never run over that long when somebody's dying to get out of a building. But yes, the reminder of the importance of staying to schedule. But the point that I was making about the biosphere is that the people in it were keenly aware that the water that they used to grow their plants and to wash themselves would in fact be the water they'd be drinking later that same day, because it was a much smaller
I have a tendency
cycle.
to believe that the water that we have on the planet is the water that we've always had. And it's,
the memories it must have.
It gets used, it gets evaporated, it comes back, and
Right.
it's
cleaned.
feeds the earth.
Yeah, it gets cleaned, and it waters the plants, it waters us, it does all of those things. And so it's very important for us.
Now we do have a caller. You'll need the
Okay.
headphones. And take a guess. It's Stuart.
Hi, Stuart.
Hello, how are you?
I am doing well. I hope that you are.
This is now a reversal of roles. I'm calling into my own show.
There you go. You don't get to do that very often.
No, I don't think I'll ever be able to do that again. So, you were talking about Jewish burial and the whole concept of putting back into the ground and making it a continuation of life.
Correct.
All right, so I have a question. Not that I've never asked you a question before.
Oh, of course not. Never.
The idea that Jews do not like the concept of cremation, is that a modern thing that arises from the Holocaust, or does that go far further back for some reason?
That has a lot to do with the Holocaust. It really does. There's an emotional charge associated with it. The word Holocaust actually means burnt offering. That's worth noting. The Hebrew name for the devastation in Europe is Shoah, which means catastrophe, and it refers more to just the everything that went on. Holocaust itself means a burnt offering, so it definitely left a very emotional charge associated with cremation. Jews have practiced different funeral rituals depending on where they are, what's going on, and what the customs are. So, for example, here in the U.S., people are typically buried in a coffin, regardless of whether they're going to be cremated or just directly interred in the ground. We have always resisted having embalmment, although certainly Joseph was embalmed and his father was embalmed. Part of that was because they were going to trek across the desert, and you certainly do not want to do that without an embalmed body, just for very obvious reasons. But here in the U.S., we do as little embalming as possible, in general none, unless you're crossing state lines and you have to do the minimum required, and you're allowed to do that. And again, that is aimed at getting the body, the molecules of the body back in. There's a reference in the book of Amos that's kind of interesting, which talks about going into your uncle's house with the man who burns the bodies and calling out and no one answers. And it's an interesting reference. It's not often discussed, but there was a man who burned the bodies. So there's something going on where burning was at some time allowed. Over time.
Is there anything else that shows that the Jews ever historically or further back, practiced the concept of cremation?
There's not a lot of it. Mostly what we hear about are people, for example, Abraham lays Sarah in a cave where theoretically the body decomposes. And we do know that there are funeral crypts and things like that typically had a shelf where a body would be laid until the flesh was gone. And then they either would put the bones in an ossuary, a box for the bones, or they sometimes even just pushed them toward the back, and there was an area in the back that collected bones until they decomposed. And eventually even bone becomes powder. Eventually it breaks down. The ideal being, though, the fastest way back into the system is to put a body into the ground.
If I hear you correctly, you're saying that even if there's cremation, if you put those remnants that still remain back in the ground, you're still fulfilling the idea of feeding the ground and continuing life.
Correct. Because those molecules go back in. At the very root, we're carbon. That's just the piece we get from science. We are carbon molecules. We're hydrocarbons because we're a life form. And other life forms need those hydrocarbons. And, eventually we're going to become part of the tree. The molecules will go into the grass or the tree or the worms, and they'll be eaten by other creatures. And then, those creatures will be eaten by other creatures, and eventually it'll come back. And the molecules continue to cycle. They don't go anywhere.
Well, you see, actually, I've learned something now about cremation. Just from listening to Ask a Rabbi.
There you go. It's something you get to do when the lawyer isn't in the studio. You get to ask a rabbi sometimes.
I have another question.
Okay.
So it's more of one of those softball pitches, because you and I both have the same perception on this. What is it that Congregation Eitz Chayim does that is different in terms of reaching out to the community, including the Islamic community?
Well,
Why?
Okay, so we are certainly active in the larger community. I'm part of the Interfaith Clergy Alliance of the Treasure Coast, and we have had guests into the congregation to talk to us about different things. We're open to learning about other religions and how they practice, and not because we want to become them, but because we want to be good neighbors. We want to be able to be friends with everyone who lives in our community. And we are a very open and welcoming congregation, and we have people who certainly come to the services. Most of them are Jewish or seeking a Jewish experience, and some of them are coming because the ones they love are doing one of those things. So everybody is welcome at our congregation. We do not put any bars up to anybody and make them do anything or say anything or anything like that. We are open to everyone in the community to be part of our community as well.
In today's environment, what is going on with people of the Islamic faith, with Muslims, even particularly the burning down of the mosque in Fort Pierce, what is it that seems to show that there's a different connection between Jews and those Muslims than perhaps other religions have shown towards them in the United States?
Well, we've had folks from the Islamic Center come and do services with us. We've talked with them. They come and answer questions periodically for our members and our guests. And we've, as part of the Interfaith Clergy Alliance of the Treasure Coast, we have done community Thanksgiving services. We've done memorial services, and for Memorial Day, we do the Four Chaplains service at the Veterans Park. We do a number of different things, and we have Muslim participation at those events.
But I guess my question, and I know the answer, but I guess my real question for the broader audience, whoever may be out there, is why? Why do we do that when right now in our society, I mean, at different times in our society, it's been the Irish or the Catholic or the Jews, but right now it's the Muslims. Why, with that negativity generalized, I mean, not everybody obviously, but generalized in our country towards that segment of those people who live here, and many of whom are Americans, why is it that we feel a connection towards them?
Why does because we've gotten to know them. We know that they're people that live in our community that are, as you said, as American as the next person. Many of them have been born here, and the majority have, in fact. And Muslims have been part of the U.S. culture. Jefferson talked about Muslims, and it's one of the groups that he identified as needing religious freedom when we found our own country. So it's.
And I don't mean to derail your whole show.
That's okay.
You're
But
fine.
I remember about a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I don't even remember whether it was before the Orlando shooting or after the Orlando shooting. We had a gentleman
Muhammad
from
Malik.
the mosque named Muhammad.
Right,
He
Muhammad
came to our
Malik.
synagogue and was talking to us about similarities between Judaism and Islam and the differences between Judaism and Islam. And what surprised me was, even when you look at the Hebrew and the Arabic, in many respects, it's so close.
It is. They share the same root language. They're both Semitic languages, and the Muslims take their tradition. They're called an Abrahamic religion, but they trace it through Ishmael, rather than through Isaac, and then Jacob. So it's we're cousins, if you will. They're monotheistic. Now, in one way, they're actually closer to Christians because Islam teaches that Jesus is the Messiah and sits at the right hand of God, which, of course, Judaism doesn't have a role for Jesus, so he's not part of our religion. And but the Muslims and the Jews both say God does not have a son, so that's the part that we're connected, but we're all monotheisms. We're all into one God, one creator, one universe, and we all share it. And you, I think, are trying to get me to talk about the 6-9, which is my favorite piece, which is, I invite anybody, draw a 6 or a 9 and turn it around and imagine two people standing at either side of it. One person sees a 6 and one sees a 9. And yet they're both looking at the same thing. And they'll never convince the other one that what they see is not what they see, because in fact they do, right? The folks sitting on the 6 side of it see a 6, and the folks sitting on the 9 side of that figure see a 9. And as you like to point out, you see a balloon with a tail. So,
but if you go on the other side, you see the other person's perspective.
Right. If you're willing to walk around the 6-9, then you realize that everybody's looking at the 6-9, and they see something slightly different, and so their approach to that 6-9 might be slightly different, but it's still the same God who created the same universe.
One last question, and I'll let you finish your own show.
All right.
We often have visitors to our congregation on Friday evenings.
Correct.
They seem all to come from Indian River State College for some reason. You have some requirements in your class, and why?
It's not just my class. It's in the world religions class. The students are expected to observe a number of different religions. They don't pray. They're welcome to pray if they choose to, but they're not expected to. They're expected to sit respectfully and observe and learn. The idea being that, hey, they're in college. You don't just get your information off of YouTube and a textbook. You actually go out into the real world and learn something. And certainly the feedback from the students it just blows any professor away who reads them. The things that the students learn by actually going. And every semester I do get a couple of students who'll say to me, can't I just watch it on YouTube? And my answer is very simple. Can you smell the pizza on YouTube? Right? There's a part
where are
of
they supposed to go?
They're supposed to go to a Jewish, a Christian, a Muslim, and a Vedic or Hindu service, because that's what we have locally here in St. Lucie County and Indian River County, within reasonable driving distance.
And for those who are teaching world religion, what is the purpose of that requirement? What's the goal?
That they actually see what a different religion than their own practices, and get an idea that, if everybody's praying to one God, most of the prayers are for peace and healing and salvation and those kinds of basically good things. People are people in the end. And
all right. Go ahead. I'll let you finish that.
Every religion has its own version of the golden rule. That is not different. Everybody's got it. The wording is slightly different from tradition to tradition. It depends in part about the culture from which that religion comes. But all of them want people to be the best person they can be. They want them to live in community, to grow the community, and they're not out to destroy other people. And
it's civility.
It's civility. It's even more than that. It's growing
it's
of the community.
It's hard to hate when you know somebody.
It's hard to hate when your kid plays soccer with them, especially if they're on the same team. Might not be quite so hard if they're on opposing teams, but but we are.
All right. Well, thank you, Rabbi. I will let you finish your own show, and I appreciate you standing in on such short notice for me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for thinking of me to come do this. I'm honored to be able to do it.
Hopefully I will see you this evening.
That sounds wonderful, and a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And so coming back to Passover and wrapping it up, one of the things that we were told is that as people came out of Egypt, it wasn't just the Jews that came. They came out as a mixed multitude. It wasn't just Jews, and it's never been just Jews. We don't live in an isolated world where people live only with, quote-unquote, their own kind. One of the things that I like to stress with my religion class, and I stress with others as well, is that there is one race in the human race. We are all humans. The genetic material that makes us look different, have different shaped eyes, different colors of skin, all of that's a very, very tiny amount of the human genome. We are at the bottom rate, just human. That doesn't mean racism isn't real. It absolutely is. There's lots of people hate because of fear. They hate because they don't know somebody else, and so they can other them. When you do get to know somebody, you break that down. And very often that is sitting down and having a meal together. So one of the ways to get to know somebody is to do that. I had expressed in the congregation that one of the things I wish I could have brought with me from Tucson, or that we could start here. There's something in Tucson called the Tucson Peace Walk, and it's 15, 16 years old now. It's been going on. It was just starting when I first moved there, and that's a lot of years ago. And what that basically was just spending a Sunday, a day, an afternoon, as many hours as we could work together with walking and with meals and with activities. And Jews, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, everybody just sat down together and got to know each other. And really, when you do that, what you discover is that we are all human. And we practice these different religions with the idea that we're going to get to learn a little bit about ourselves and about each other. And we really are only approaching one creator of one universe on one planet. Hopefully someday we'll travel and go to other planets, but it'll still be the same universe. It's the same creator. And it's not about destroying God's creation. It's about helping God's creation be everything it's supposed to be. And when we do that, I think then we'll really begin to understand what it is that the wonderful teachers of old were really trying to teach us to do, to be what Confucius called chunzi, a good person. May we all reach out and do that. And we do the festivals to help us grow and learn about ourselves and each other.
And come together.
Absolutely. That's really what it's all about. And this is spring, this is rebirth, a time of hope. May everybody have a great spring, whatever you celebrate.
So this was Ask a Lawyer, turned into Ask a Rabbi here on WPSL. We're pretty much out of time. Give us your Facebook and your website again.
Okay, the Facebook is eitzchayim.org, eitzchayim.org, or you can look for Eitz Chayim, same spelling, on Facebook. We're a group there. We love to talk to you, and hopefully I can answer some more questions.
And next week, Stuart will be back with Ask a Lawyer here on WPSL.